Howdy, Sun Devils, and welcome back to History 110. Today, we will be examining the question, what is history? And now, at first glance, this might seem to be kind of an obvious question. History is clearly what we know about the past. It's what happened. It's all that we remember. And yet the truth is that history is a bit more complex than any of this. To give you an example, if you think back to your high school days, you probably had an opportunity in your science classes to see just how many different ways there are of scientifically studying our universe. So in your chemistry class, you probably mixed chemicals, hopefully safely. In your biology class, you probably got the chance to dissect some kind of animal or insect, and in your physics class, you probably watched as your teacher use different items like feathers and bowling balls to demonstrate the different universal laws that govern the reality that we know. And so you ended up graduating knowing that scientists use all sorts of different methods to study the world around us, and you knew that these methods had developed over time, that from Galileo's telescope to satellites to space stations, that scientists have continually improved their methods and developed new ones for their studies. And similarly, when you went to your art or literature classes then in high school, you probably read novels and wrote poems and tried your hand at things like painting and sculpting and other forms of art. And along the way, you learned that different art techniques had also developed over time. Yet, it's probably likely that your history classes were a little bit different than either of these, either the arts or the sciences. And now, maybe you had a fantastic history teacher, someone who made the material easy to understand and who made the stories just really come alive. And if you did, as a side note, you should probably contact them and let them know how much their work meant, because it really means a lot to teachers when they hear from former students. So just a little side note there. But in general, if you had the average U.S. high school experience, you were probably tossed a textbook, given a massive amount of facts to memorize, and kind of told to just do your best to keep up. And so if you were like me, then you might have reached your college classes with no real idea that history, the modern way that we study the past, is actually a relatively new thing. And in that short time, it's changed dramatically. So in this lesson, we will be exploring how the modern methods of history developed and how history is somewhat different from the past and how it's somewhat different from our memories. But first, let's begin by taking a look at what a few famous figures have said about history, because everybody loves quotes, right? So first up, we have quite possibly the most well-known description of history. It's from George Santayana, and he wrote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And you might have heard this phrase differently, something along the lines of, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. But the general idea here, Santayana's words, have actually been preserved on a plaque over at Auschwitz at one of the campsites. And the purpose of that is to serve as a kind of reminder to humanity that forgetting the past, forgetting what has happened in our history, could carry a very, very heavy price. And now if we think about what Santayana is saying here, what he's actually putting forward is an idea that history is cyclical, that it repeats. So he's presenting life and all of its suffering, all of its cruelty as something that happens over and over and over when we don't pay attention to things. And that it's only through history, through the remembering of where things have gone wrong before, that people can make corrections, they can learn from their mistakes, and they can avoid this cycle and move on to something better. Now, Santayana was somewhat optimistic that people could learn from their mistakes and break free from the cycles of human cruelty, whereas others, like Aldous Huxley, were a little bit more pessimistic. And Huxley said that men do not learn very much from history. This is the most important lesson of all in history. And so we've had a bit of a contrast here, and stepping in between them is good old Mark Twain, who said history does not repeat itself. Okay, so he's kind of poking fun at the idea of history being cyclical. He said it doesn't repeat itself, but it does often rhyme. And while he was clearly making a bit of a joke here, Twain being a pretty sarcastic guy, there's also a good bit of wisdom in it as well, because very often we think that we've learned from history in the way that Santayana tells us to, when in reality all we're doing is we're just looking for the same cast of villains or the same exact problems to reappear, which in reality we find that troubles usually come in different forms with variations on their earlier versions. And so we end up getting caught off guard because we were looking for the exact same thing to happen. We were looking for history to repeat itself when history isn't quite cyclical like that. It doesn't repeat itself perfectly. And so the idea that history doesn't repeat, but that it does rhyme, that we do see similar patterns, not the exact same ones over and over, is a pretty helpful thing to remember. And now one of my absolute favorite quotes about history actually comes from our former Vice President Dan Quayle, who, if you remember anything about Dan Quayle, the Vice President from basically 1988 to 1992, he had some pretty awkward moments in his political career. He wasn't someone that you wanted to ask how to spell potato. You can look that one up. But he said that people that are really very weird can get into sensitive positions and have a tremendous impact on history. And I can tell you that the more you study history and the characters in it, the more this quote actually makes a lot of sense. Even some of the greatest characters in history, when you really dig into their stories, you find that they often had some oddities about them. So now, what can we do with history? Well, two of the most useful descriptions that I found of it come from Norman Cousins and then Peter N. Stearns. And now, Cousins was a political journalist, commentator. He was someone who traveled the world and was very in touch with the politics of the Cold War era. And so he saw history as what he called a vast early warning system. And then Peter Stearns, who, if you ever took a world history AP course, there's a very good chance that he wrote your textbook. He referred to history as the laboratory of human experience. So with both of these, we get the idea that history can do something for us, that understanding the past can benefit us in some way here in the present. And so I like both these descriptions because they tell us that history can serve a purpose. It can tell us things about the present. So whether it's giving us warnings of impending disasters or presenting us with examples of where things have gone right, it has these uses. And so Stearns' idea of history as a laboratory is especially useful because the laboratory is where we conduct experiments. And the reason that we conduct experiments inside of a laboratory is that it gives us a relatively controlled environment. So in that controlled environment, you can isolate the variables that you want to test, and you can feel reasonably confident that the outcomes of your experiments weren't influenced by some kind of outside force or some other variables. You have a good idea that what you tested is why you got the results that you did. And so in the same way, this is really kind of similar to what we try to do when we write history. Now, the difference is that we don't get to run historical events back and forth, okay? We don't get to repeat them in the same way that we repeat experiments and observe the results. So we have to use slightly different methods here. But the idea that history presents us with essentially one-time experiments, or depending on how broadly we're looking at things, maybe we do have multiple instances of a certain type of event happening. But that in observing history, we kind of have this laboratory of human experience that we can learn from. And so just like the scientist has numerous variables that they have to account for and that the laboratory tries to shield their experiments from, in the same way the historian is faced with the past with a similarly infinite set of facts and data points. And so the role of the historian is actually to select from these data points those facts which we wish to specifically examine. And now the process of selecting facts and then linking them together through cause and effect is what we call creating historical narratives. And probably one of the best descriptions of this actually came from one of my former professors back in Texas, Dr. Stephanie Cole, who said that every time you put two facts together, in a sense, you're making choices, you're linking them together, and thus you create a narrative. So, how much information is in a moment of time? Well, you might be sitting here thinking, well, okay, the past seems pretty self-explanatory. What happened, happened, and if we just look back on it, do we really have to be that selective? Can't we just tell people what happened in the past and leave it at that? And that's a great question. But we're going to answer that question in a few different ways. And we're going to start with one of my favorite breakdowns of just how much information a single moment in time contains, which has been provided by the mathematician and physicist John Bayes. So Bayes, who teaches and researches at the University of California in Riverside, has drawn upon the work of other physicists, mathematicians, and digital information technologists to try to calculate just how much information is actually out in the world around us right now, in terms of the digital bits and bytes that we're probably familiar with. And so right up front, let me let you know that you do not need to memorize these figures. You'll not be tested on them, and I'm only giving them here to make the point that the past contains far more facts, far more data than we could ever hope to say anything about. So if we look at the work that Bayes and others have done, we see that, okay, so 1 bit in computer language is the answer to 1 binary or yes or no question, and that's why when you look at computer programming, it's in the form of ones and zeros, yeses or nos, ons and offs. And that the bytes that we're familiar with, kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, if you're viewing this on a laptop, it probably runs somewhere in the neighborhood of between 120 and maybe 300 gigabytes of storage space in it. And so 1 byte is equal to 8 bits. And we can see that 2 kilobytes, roughly 2,000 bytes or 16,000 bits, will give you 1 typewritten page, whereas 5 megabytes, which is 10 million bytes, can give you the complete work of Shakespeare, and 1.25 gigabytes can give you the entire human genome, and 10 terabytes, which is quite a bit of storage space. But then again, you can still buy external hard drives today that can give you, I don't know, 4 to 6 terabytes of storage space. So, you pick up 2 of those, and on them you can contain all of the printed works that are housed in the US Library of Congress. So, this sounds impressive, but at the same time, it's pretty manageable, it seems, by the scale of human technology today. And yet, what if we want to actually describe the information that something real, something tangible out in the world contains? What kind of data does that require? Well, if you just wanted to describe the data contained in a single human red blood cell, down to every single subatomic particle, you're going to need 500 petabytes, which I did the math, and given the size of the average PlayStation 5 hard drive, it would be about 500,000 PlayStation 5s required to contain all of the information that just a single human red blood cell contains. If you wanted to contain a single gram of liquid water, which is roughly 20 drops, you would need 500 zettabytes, which again is about 500 billion PlayStation 5 hard drives, just to describe a gram of water in one single instance, where all of its subatomic particles are. And if you wanted to describe the entire universe, you could pause this right here and count up all the zeros. It's an absolutely ridiculous number. And so I'm presenting this just to let you know that this is how much information is out there in every single moment in the physical universe. And so the past, which is the entire sum of all that information, is far beyond anything that we could hope to recreate or distill down into some kind of perfect summary. And that's why we do history. History is us venturing out into that wilderness of data and trying to construct something that we can comprehend and has some kind of meaning for us. And now I should also say that as far as actually attempting to scan and measure and recreate this kind of turning physical items into digital information, there was actually a team of researchers at the Allen Institute for Brain Sciences in, I believe it's Seattle, Washington, which successfully scanned a portion of a mouse's brain. They took 1 cubic millimeter of the mouse's brain, which is roughly the size of a grain of sand, and they cut that grain of mouse brain into 25,000 slices, and then scanned those 25,000 slices of a grain of mouse brain with an electron microscope for 5 months. They produced over 100 million images. And when they finally assembled all of those images into a 3D model, The result contained over 2 petabytes, or about 2,000 PlayStation 5s, worth of data. But then again, the scan only went down to the cellular level of the brain, and it didn't get anywhere close to the molecular or the subatomic level of detail that we might actually need if we wanted to, say, scan and recreate a brain. So, all of this information forms the past, which is something distinct from history. History is our attempt to make sense of that past, and so in trying to make sense of the past, that's where we find ourselves constructing narratives. Okay, so in other words, we might say that history is an interpretation based upon representations of the past. We can never reconstruct the past, but we can represent it. So for example, you're experiencing a moment of time in the present, you take a photograph, you take a bit of video, you have thus created a representation of that past. It doesn't contain all of the information of that moment, but it gives us something. Similar to how a written document gives us a representation of the past, an artifact, a building, some pottery shards, these different things are all representative of the past, but they aren't those exact moments themselves. And so history is how we go in and we interpret these things. And now, this is one of the most common technical descriptions of history, and in a lot of ways, if you were to go to grad school for history, this definition is really at the core of a lot of what you'd learn. So, if you memorize this, take it to heart, apply it in your work, then who knows? Maybe I would have saved a lot of you guys a lot of time and money as far as going to grad school, because this is really kind of what it's about here. So, how have societies and their historians over time gone about interpreting the past and forming their own historical narratives? Well, this is what we refer to as historiography, or the history of history. These different methods of examining and interpreting the past and how these methods have developed and changed over time is what we refer to as historiography. So how we do history and then how we've done history over time. All of that is what historiography is. So we're going to begin now by looking at a few different methods of history and the different kinds of narratives that these approaches allow us to tell. So first up, 2 of the most common forms of writing history from ancient times were what we might call great man history or theodicy / providential history. And now with great man history, the way this approach works is that historians would identify those seemingly exceptional individuals, usually men, but sometimes women, and write history around them. As one old-timey historian once said, the history of the world is but the biography of great men. And nowadays, though, professional academic historians tend to try to avoid great person history, just because there's simply too many other factors to account for in explaining major historical shifts. But that's not to say that people don't enjoy reading books about larger-than-life figures. And if you go to Barnes & Noble or the bookstores at airports, you can see that obviously you can make some good money if you have a knack for writing biographies of these popular figures for the common reader. There's always going to be a market for that stuff. Now, as for theodicy or providential history, the theo, which indicates theology, should give us an indication. This is referring to kind of a supernatural interpretation of history. And again, it was one of the common ways of interpreting history since ancient times. And so when ancient people weren't writing histories about legendary heroes, they typically attributed history and its changes to the gods or supernatural forces. And this style of interpretation tended to describe history as the unfolding of a divine plan, and most importantly, a plan that would ultimately culminate in some kind of supernatural ending. So whether that was a glorious ending or a catastrophic ending varied across different societies, but they were all what we would call teleological. And I'll add this definition here. Teleology is the idea that the future is already determined and that history will inevitably lead us to that specific state or condition. And again, could be a good utopian kind of heaven on earth condition, or it could be the end of days, Ragnarok, some kind of catastrophic destruction here. But this is what teleology means. And so for theodicies or providential history, this was a teleological way of viewing history, that God or the gods or some kind of supernatural force was in charge of the present moment and was guiding it towards some kind of future end state. And now, while historians might roll their eyes at great person history, they're generally even more opposed to these teleological interpretations because they necessarily require some kind of, we might call it faith, in something that is clearly outside of history and therefore able to direct it. But I should note that it is not only the supernatural interpretations which fit this description. Two other ways of viewing history that were also teleological were Marxist history and Whig history. And now, when you hear the term Marxist history, I realize that it's pretty easy to just immediately jump to communism. But Karl Marx's theory of history was actually much, much, much broader. According to Marx and many Marxist historians, social and material conditions, so for example, the way that different groups of people arranged their labor and the different tools, technology, and capital that they used to enact that labor, that these things would change over time and would inevitably lead to the creation of a classless society. And now, whether Marx is actually proven right or wrong someday, the idea that history is somehow already determined and headed towards a specific destination creates a lot of problems for most historians today, because again, it's teleological, and that's not really within the scope of history as we study it today. And then as for Whig history, this one's pretty much fallen out of favor. It was popular back in the 1800s and the early 1900s. It was a very optimistic view of human civilization in which the world would, through advancing technology and expanding democracy and increasing liberty, progress higher and higher and higher, and conditions and living standards would just improve across the board. But if you look at its rise and then decline, you'll notice that it was really hard for these Whig historians to maintain that optimism after World War I, a global depression, World War II, a nuclear standoff in the Cold War. And so it's a lot more difficult for historians these days to maintain that kind of optimism that the Whigs were able to hold on to. So, moving beyond the teleological approaches, some of the other common approaches have been, say, diplomatic and military history. So, for both military and diplomatic history, what these historians see as being the most important set of facts in the past that we need to pull out and construct our historical narratives with are the ways in which nations have clashed or cooperated. And now, military history in particular has had its ups and downs over the last couple of decades. If you look across the universities in the country, military history programs have expanded, they've shrunk, it's been a bit of a wild ride. And one of the reasons for that is that while people will always be fascinated by stories of war and heroism in battle, military history can make other historians a bit uncomfortable because the uncertainty of every battle means that it's very easy to venture into what's called counterfactual history. And now counterfactual history is basically what-if history. It's easy for military historians to ask, how would history be different if this particular battle had turned out differently? And then to begin imagining some kind of altered past based on that new outcome. So if you've ever watched the TV show The Man in the High Castle, if you've ever read, I believe his name's Harry Turtledove, he's a fiction writer who takes alternate history. It's a pretty popular genre. It can be a lot of fun to dabble in. I personally, given the fact that we don't get to repeat history, we don't get to run it back and forth and observe it like we can laboratory experiments, I actually find counterfactual history to be very useful because it gives us an opportunity to really test, in the best way that we can as historians, to test which events actually matter. Because if we can imagine a very, very plausible scenario where things, an event plays out differently, but the end result is still the same, well, then maybe that event or the actual historical event aren't quite as important as we think. Or if we take a seemingly small event and we change it, and suddenly it becomes very likely that history would have played out incredibly different, then maybe we need to go back to that seemingly small event and give it a little bit more importance. So, when used responsibly, I do believe that there are some very good uses for counterfactual history. However, when you ask what-if questions, you typically have to then zoom in on specific events or specific decisions made by specific people. in order to really make them work. And that's not the general way that a lot of historians approach things. For a lot of historians, they're more comfortable focusing on the larger scale social forces that have played out through history and shaped its trends and its changes over time. And in fact, there are many scientists who believe that there's actually no such thing as free will. And a lot of these scientists actually credit a guy named Benjamin Libet as having proved this, because Libet discovered that a lot of our conscious decisions appear to always be preceded by spontaneous and subconscious reactions in the brain. So therefore, if your conscious decisions are just emerging from subconscious reactions in the brain, it kind of throws a wrench in the idea of, well, what if they had made different decisions? And while you'd be hard-pressed to find a historian who doesn't believe that we possess free will, the general consensus among historians is really that these larger social, political, economic forces, that those are what tend to dictate the course of history more so than individual decisions. And so in fact, for most historians, a lot of their work centers on what we might call social or cultural history. And these are two of the most popular fields, and it's here that historians examine social trends and cultural ideas, how they develop, how they're transmitted between people, how they're preserved, and how they change over time. And a lot of the work that's done in these fields also overlaps and encompasses a large part of everything from women's history to ethnic studies to the histories of different religious groups to LGBTQ history and many, many, many other groups. And now, as we move through this list, one that might be a little surprising, world history probably seems fairly self-explanatory. It's the study of, not only the various peoples across the planet, but also of the connections that they've made with each other. And it just seems like a very natural way of studying history for us here in the present day. But you might be surprised to learn that world history is actually one of the newest fields, and it only began to be commonly taught in schools in really the late 1980s. So for most of you, if you took World History AP, there's a good chance your parents probably had the opportunity to take a World History AP class, or a World History class. But for your grandparents and for generations before them, what they found when they came into their high schools and their universities were Western civilization courses, which focused on typically Egypt to Greece to Rome to medieval Europe to the modern era and expanding west to North America, places like Australia. So a very white, very Western, very Christian approach to history, whereas now you can still find a few Western civilization courses out there, but in general, most schools are offering world history classes now. They're expanding the scope of this to everyone else, Asia, Africa, South America, and you get a much more complete view of history through that. And now the last one here, the one that I've saved for the very end, is quantitative history. And now the reason I've saved this for last is because this approach really provides one of the best examples for how these different methods, these different approaches, can radically affect the narratives that historians end up telling. So quantitative history is the approach of viewing the past through quantifiable numerical data. And this particular approach became very popular in the 1960s and 70s, along with computers. The proliferation of computing hardware and all of the calculations that they could perform made quantitative history a lot easier for historians to perform. You could just enter the data and it would crunch the numbers for you. And now, during this time, in 1974, we had two economists, two guys named Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman, who actually used this method to re-examine the institution of slavery. And what they found was, well, going by the numbers, if you compared the grams of protein that the average slave consumed in their diet versus the diets of northern factory workers, and if you looked at things like the square footage in slave cabins compared to the crowded rooms that factory workers often shared, well, you found that the institution of slavery had some benefits compared to other forms of labor. Okay, so obviously this book was, and it actually continues to be, highly debated, but I should note that the authors made it clear then, and they have continued to, that they weren't actually trying to defend slavery by any means. They were simply following the numbers. But of course, for anyone looking at the actual history of slavery, nobody cares about how much protein slaves ate. The history of slavery, the meaningful data that comes out of it, is the fact that this was an institution that dehumanized people, and it turned people into property. Okay, so this is how, depending on what approach you take, you can end up with different results, even results that, in the larger scheme of things, might not make a whole lot of sense. So, one of the reasons why Engerman and Fogel attracted so much attention and controversy, and their work and this quantitative style of history continues to be debated by historians, one of the reasons for this is that what they were engaging in is what we refer to as revisionism. And now, we'll be completely upfront here, okay? I understand that revisionism is a very loaded term these days. To take a more cynical approach to this, we can look at the words of Samuel Butler, who wrote, "God cannot alter the past, though historians can." And yes, it is absolutely true that we have seen governments and... Okay, that slide was out of order. This is where we should be right now. We have seen governments and certain individuals try to rewrite history. So if we think back, we might think of, certain governments like in the Soviet Union, where they would literally try to erase people from photographs. We can look at, some of the more deceitful authors out there who are either so incredibly selective with the facts that they're using, or who attempt to exaggerate their facts to stretch the truth so far that the end result is basically something that we would refer to as false history. It's just not true. It might have some tenuous basis in factual history, but it's just gotten to the point of ridiculousness, and it's clearly the wrong kind of revisionism. But this association of revisionism with deceit, deception, the denial of certain historical events is actually incredibly unfortunate, because the term does have a technical meaning in the field of history. And now to go back to that previous slide, historian James McPherson has given a good example of the legitimate reasons for engaging in historical revisionism. And he's written that the 14,000 members of the American Historical Association know that revision is the lifeblood of historical scholarship. History is a continuing dialogue between the present and the past. Interpretations of the past are subject to change in response to new evidence, new questions asked of the evidence, new perspectives gained by the passage of time, and so thus there is no single eternal and immutable truth about the past events and their meaning. And it's this unending quest of historians for understanding the past, that is what we would call, in historical terms, revisionism, that makes history vital and meaningful. So, McPherson here has identified really the two big reasons for engaging in legitimate revisionism. One, pretty obviously, is that we discover new evidence. So certainly if we discover or gain access to new evidence, it's probably going to change the way that we view the past. And one of the best examples of this was in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, when US and European historians were finally granted access to the archives there in the Soviet Union. And so these historians who for the past almost 50 years had been locked out from the Soviet Union and its block of satellite states, they were suddenly able to go and peek behind the Iron Curtain, and what they found in the archives led a lot of them to revise the arguments that they had made over that past half century when they had been cut off from that evidence. So in addition to finding new evidence, the other and honestly much more common reason for engaging in legitimate revisionism is where McPherson says that we ask new questions of the existing evidence, and that as we go through life and as society changes, we gain new perspectives. And this is probably the single most important reason for this, because although the past itself never changes, we, here in the present, do change. We constantly change. And so our relationship to the past, even if it is fixed, is going to inevitably change along with the present. And so the world today has very different needs and is asking very different questions of its past than the world in 1950 or the world in 1750. The needs of people are different, and so they look to the past for different things. And so we also experience this in our own lives as we grow. For example, I'm sure that many of you, if you look back on your childhood or past relationship that you had with others, that you'll notice that your perspective of those things, your relationship to those fixed events, which are part of the past, continue to change as you grow older and, hopefully develop more wisdom and maturity. And as you experience new things, it leads you to look back on the past with a new perspective. So, while we should always be on guard against bad or unethical revisionism, we should also keep in mind that history will continue to change and undergo revision, because that's how it works with the present being continually changing. History is our link to the past, and although the past isn't going to change, we are. And so as we change, we continually ask new questions of it, and we engage in legitimate revisionism.